Here is a paraphrased version of the script, maintaining the original writing style and articulation while altering the word order. Midnight, Appalachia holds 20 forgotten secrets so hard to believe, they could easily be dismissed as mere local folklore. Yet, what awaits your discovery is far more unsettling than any story whispered around a mountain campfire. Hidden deep within the secluded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where ancient hills are draped in mist like secrets that refuse to vanish, there lived families whose bloodlines never ventured past the ridges that enclosed them. 028, it was 1923, and along Troublesome Creek, the Fugate family had become something incomprehensible to the outside world. Their skin possessed a blue hue. Not a poetic turn of phrase, not a faint suggestion, but a genuine blue, reminiscent of a summer sky reflected on their features. This family carried a genetic quirk called methemoglobinemia for generations, a condition perpetuated through countless unions between cousins, uncles and nieces, brothers and sisters-in-law who all traced their roots back to common grandparents. 102. These mountains, through isolation, created biological islands where the same lineage circulated in an ever-tightening loop. The story began in 1820 when Martin Fugate arrived from France, settling in the remote hills of Perry County. He carried a recessive gene that, under typical circumstances, would have vanished into the genetic melting pot of America. 127, but Martin chose to marry his cousin, Elizabeth Smith. Together, they built a cabin in a hollow so cut off that a journey of just 5 miles consumed an entire day. For their children, the only available spouses were from the limited circle of neighbors, who were, inevitably, also kin. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Fugate family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a vine strangling itself in a tangled knot. 153, Benjamin Fugate took his second cousin Rachel as his wife. Their son, Zachariah, then wed his first cousin, Mary. The genetic noose tightened with each passing generation, and every marriage between relatives increased the odds that the recessive gene for blue skin would manifest. When Luna Fugate was born in 1906, the midwife nearly dropped the infant in shock. 217, the newborn's skin was the deep blue of a fresh bruise, her lips tinged an almost purple color. Her mother's tears weren't of joy, but came from a horrible realization that the family's affliction had surfaced again. Luna's brother, Zachary, shared the same intense blue color. Their condition was so stark that upon starting school, other children would flee in terror, screaming, convinced they were demons or the living dead. 240, the family wasn't isolated merely by accident. The Appalachian Mountains provided natural barriers, but societal forces constructed even greater walls. Upon learning of the Blue people, outsiders offered no help or comprehension. Instead, they gave ridicule, fear, and eventually, a deliberate shunning. This reaction only drove the Fugates deeper into their genetic predicament. 304, with no infusion of new blood, the blue skin became more frequent, more vivid, and more impossible to ignore with each new generation. Life in their hollow followed rhythms unchanged for 100 years. They farmed small, rocky plots, hunted deer and turkey in forests that seemed to swallow every sound, and gathered for Sunday worship in a one-room church where every attendee shared at least 3 sets of grandparents. 330, the men married women they'd known since birth, frequently their own cousins or nieces. The women had little option but to accept proposals from male relatives, all of them trapped by geography, poverty, and a culture that had normalized what the outside world deemed an abomination. The scientific explanation wouldn't be uncovered until 1960 by Dr. Madison Corin. 355, however, the Fugates already sensed the truth instinctively. They were bearing the cost of genetic seclusion, of bloodlines that never blended with fresh streams. Every blue baby served as a reminder that their family had interbred for so long that hidden traits were surfacing, like long-buried secrets clawing their way out. 418, the condition impacted more than just skin tone. The Fugate children battled shortness of breath, fatigue, and a persistent feeling of suffocation, even in the open air. Their blood struggled to transport oxygen properly, leaving them in a state of perpetual exhaustion, as if the burden of their convoluted family tree pressed down on their lungs. Yet, they endured, had children, and bequeathed the condition to the following generation. 443, because in those isolated hollows, survival meant accepting whatever life and family handed you. Whispers about the Fugates circulated among neighboring families, but they weren't an isolated case. The Whitaker family, the Colt clan, the Blue family of Troublesome Creek, numerous Appalachian lineages had become closed genetic circuits. 506, each one developed its own distinct markers of inbreeding. Some had extra digits, others profound intellectual disabilities, and some exhibited conditions that medical science wouldn't classify for decades. These families were concealed by the mountains like shameful secrets, and they hid themselves in return. By 1930, the Fugate family had grown to over 60 people, almost all interconnected through multiple ancestral lines. 534, family reunions were redundant because every get-together was, by definition, a family reunion. The blue-skinned members were regarded with a peculiar mix of acceptance and dread. Within the family circle, they were simply Luna, simply Zachary, just another cousin. But when rare outsiders happened upon their hollow, those with blue skin were hurried into back rooms, kept away from windows, treated like evidence of something unspeakable. 603, growing up, the children knew they were different without fully grasping why. They played in the same creek their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had, in a landscape that never changed because nothing new ever arrived. The same bloodlines, the same land, the same genetic lottery producing the same outcomes. 626, blue skin, respiratory issues, and a silent understanding that their family was both their entire universe and their confinement. As the 1930s arrived, bringing the full force of the Great Depression to Appalachia, the genetic fallout of isolation grew impossible to overlook. For the Fugate family, their blue skin was merely the most obvious sign of a deeper decay spreading through lineages sealed off for too long. 709, over in the neighboring county, the Whitaker family contended with their own genetic inheritance. Unlike the Fugates, their condition wasn't visible in their complexion, but in the makeup of their minds and bodies. 3 generations of unions between cousins resulted in children with profound cognitive impairments. Some were unable to speak, while others remained developmentally stuck at a toddler's level, even as adults. 735, their home was a ramshackle cluster of buildings connected by muddy paths, their world shrinking annually as the outside world forgot they were there. Ray Whitaker, born in 1932, was the result of a union between first cousins who were themselves children of first cousins. When his parents, both carriers of recessive genes for intellectual disability, reproduced, they created a genetic storm. 804, Ray would never learn to read, never secure a job, never find a spouse outside his immediate family. His days were spent rocking on a dangerously tilted porch, communicating with grunts and gestures, his mind trapped in a fog that no amount of patience or teaching could lift. But Ray wasn't alone. 826, his sister Betty was similarly impaired, as were 4 of their 6 siblings. They survived on subsistence farming and the kindness of slightly less affected relatives, caught in a cycle where the only potential marriage partners were those who shared their genetic burden. When Betty reached adulthood, she married her cousin Timmy, himself the product of another cousin marriage. 850, their children arrived with even more profound impairments. Some couldn't walk, others had facial deformities that made eating a challenge and speech impossible. The mountain communities developed a harsh practicality concerning such families. They were helped when absolutely essential, avoided whenever feasible, and never, ever mentioned to those from outside. 915, local doctors, the few who ventured into these remote areas, learned to manage conditions they'd never encountered in medical school. Infants born with hearts positioned on the wrong side of their chests. Children with hands bearing 6 fingers. Adults whose eyes couldn't track movement correctly. These were the telltale signs of inbreeding. 937, genetic markers that announced their presence with brutal honesty. Perhaps the darkest story belonged to the Colt family, residing in a hollow so remote it was absent from most maps. Starting in the 1880s, for 4 generations, they had practiced what could only be termed deliberate genetic seclusion. The patriarch, Jeremiah Colt, held the belief that mixing blood with outsiders would weaken the family line. 1004, he pushed his children to wed each other, arranged marriages between siblings, and in doing so, founded a dynasty of genetic catastrophe that would resonate through the decades. By 1940, some members of the Colt family couldn't function outside their compound. Some had legs that refused to straighten, forcing them into a permanent crouch. 1027, others had respiratory systems so compromised that climbing a single flight of stairs would leave them breathless. Intellectual impairment was so widespread that normal intelligence became the anomaly rather than the standard. Yet, they continued to have children within the family. Every generation added new layers of genetic harm to an already crumbling base. 1051, the women in these families bore a disproportionate burden. They had child after child, many stillborn or dying shortly after birth, their bodies unable to handle the genetic load of inbreeding. Miscarriages happened frequently, infant mortality was shockingly high, and the children who did survive often needed constant care throughout their lives. A woman might give birth 10 times and only see 3 children make it to adulthood. 1117, each pregnancy was a genetic gamble that the family almost always lost. Social seclusion strengthened genetic seclusion. The blue-skinned Fugates, the intellectually impaired Whitakers, the physically deformed Colts, they all withdrew further into their hollows, constructing higher walls of secrecy around their communities. 1140, outsiders who accidentally stumbled upon these families departed with stories that sounded like folklore. Tales of blue people and families with 6 fingers, stories too bizarre to seem real. But real they were. Horrifyingly real. Living proof of what occurs when human bloodlines loop back on themselves too many times. 1202, the few children who exhibited normal development confronted an impossible dilemma: stay and accept the genetic gamble of marrying a cousin, or leave and forsake the only family they had ever known. Most chose to stay. The mountains held them, much like gravity. Family bonds proved stronger than the desire for genetic health, and so the cycle persisted. A boy of normal intelligence would grow up, marry his cousin because she was the only unmarried woman in the hollow, and father children who might carry the genetic burden for another generation. Local churches. 1237, preached against unions between close relatives, but the sermons felt hollow in communities where everyone was already related. A preacher might thunder about the sins of inappropriate unions, then go home to a wife who was his second cousin. The hypocrisy was an understood but never discussed communal secret, shared by everyone but mentioned by no one. 1302, by the time World War II drew young men out of the mountains and into the wider world, some families had lived in genetic isolation for over a century. The Fugates had their blue skin. The Whitakers had their cognitive impairments. The Colts had their physical deformities. And dozens of other families had their own genetic signatures. 1325, club feet, deafness, blindness, conditions appearing in every generation with predictable regularity. The 1960s introduced something new to the secluded hollows of Appalachia: scientific curiosity. Dr. Madison Corin, a hematologist from the University of Kentucky, heard whispers of the blue people and decided to explore what others had dismissed as mountain folklore. 1353, in 1960, he found the Fugate family, still blue, still isolated, still reproducing within their closed genetic circle. Patrick and Rachel Fugate, both blue-skinned and both descendants of numerous cousin marriages, let Dr. Corin into their home, their feelings a blend of suspicion and desperate hope. They had spent their entire lives as medical oddities, shunned by neighbors, gawked at by strangers. 1422, their condition untreatable because no one understood its cause. Dr. Corin dedicated months to studying the family's blood, mapping their genealogy, and documenting the intricate web of relationships that had produced this genetic phenomenon. His discoveries were both fascinating and horrifying. The Fugates carried a recessive gene for methemoglobinemia, a condition hindering blood from efficiently carrying oxygen. 1451, in a typical population, this gene might appear once in millions. But within the Fugate's closed genetic loop, where the same ancestors appeared dozens of times in each person's family tree, the gene had become widespread. The family tree Corin constructed resembled a nightmare of crossed lines and circular connections. 1516, Martin Fugate appeared as an ancestor to every single blue-skinned family member, sometimes 8 or 10 times in one individual's lineage. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and cousins married each other so frequently that calculating genetic relationships became nearly impossible. The blue skin was merely the most visible outcome of this genetic concentration. 1539, concealed beneath were countless other conditions, some minor, some devastating, all resulting from a gene pool stirred with the same spoon for far too long. Corin's treatment was remarkably straightforward. An injection of methylene blue dye into the bloodstream could temporarily relieve the symptoms, but the relief was temporary because the genetic root cause remained. 1606, each Fugate who received the injection would see their skin return to a normal color within hours, only to fade back to blue within days. The treatment offered a glimpse of normality but couldn't erase the genetic truth inscribed in every cell of their bodies. Luna Fugate, now in her 50s, wept upon seeing her skin turn pink for the first time. 1631, she stared at her hands, at her reflection in a mirror, and experienced a deep grief for all the years she had spent blue, avoided, treated as less than human. But the moment passed, the blue returned, and Luna understood that some genetic inheritances can't be erased with a simple injection. The publicity from Corin's discovery brought unwelcome attention to the Fugates and other secluded families. 1659, journalists flocked to the hollows, cameras flashing, notebooks filling with sensational tales of America's hidden genetic disasters. The families retreated even further, building literal and metaphorical fences to keep the curious at bay. Some families moved deeper into the mountains, to places even more remote, where they could continue their lives without judgment or scrutiny. 1724, but the scientific awakening was unstoppable. Geneticists began studying other isolated communities, documenting the consequences of generations of cousin marriage. They discovered a catalogue of genetic horrors. Communities where half the children were born with cleft palates. Families where diabetes and heart disease struck every generation. 1748, isolated populations with rates of genetic disorders hundreds of times higher than the national average. The Whittaker family, discovered by researchers in 1967, became a case study in the long-term effects of genetic isolation. Over 5 generations, the family had 43 members, 31 of whom displayed some form of cognitive or physical impairment. 1814, the researchers mapped the relationships and found that every member of the 4th and 5th generations was the product of at least 3 different cousin marriages in their immediate ancestry. The genetic diversity that protects most populations had been completely eliminated, replaced by a genetic uniformity that manifested in profound disability. 1836, when researchers interviewed Lorraine Whittaker, a woman of relative normality in a family devastated by genetic disorders, she explained the family's reasoning with heartbreaking simplicity. We married who was there. Nobody else would have us, and we couldn't leave. This is our home, our land, our family. If that means marrying your cousin, well, that's what you do. 1902, her words captured the trap perfectly. Geographic isolation created social isolation, which created genetic isolation, which created physical and mental conditions that increased social isolation, completing a vicious cycle spinning for generations. Breaking free required resources, education, and opportunities that simply didn't exist in these remote hollows. 1930, the research also brought to light families that had deliberately chosen genetic isolation. The Colt clan, when finally studied in depth in 1971, admitted that their patriarch had actively discouraged marriage outside the family. Jeremiah Colt's belief in keeping the bloodline pure had created a genetic nightmare. Yet his descendants, even while suffering the effects, defended his choice. 8 p.m., he wanted to keep us together, explained Marcus Colt, a man with severe physical deformities and limited cognitive function. Family is everything. We don't need outsiders. This is the moment where I need you to feel something. Think about Luna Fugate looking at her pink hands, or Lorraine Whitaker explaining why she married her cousin, or Marcus Colt defending the very beliefs that destroyed his health. 2028, if you're watching this and thinking about how society fails its most vulnerable people, drop a comment right now saying isolation isn't just geographic, it's genetic, social, and tragically permanent. Let me know you understand the depth of this tragedy. By the 1980s, improved roads and mandatory education laws began to penetrate even the most remote Appalachian communities. 2057, the genetic isolation that had lasted for over a century started to crack, but the damage was already done. The children and grandchildren of cousin marriages carried genetic time bombs that would express themselves for generations to come. The Fugate family's blue skin began appearing less frequently as some members married outsiders, diluting the genetic concentration that caused the condition. But other effects persisted. 2126, heart problems, breathing difficulties, and a predisposition to blood disorders ran through the family like underground rivers, invisible but still flowing. Sarah Fugate, born in 1978 to parents who were second cousins, didn't have blue skin, but collapsed during gym class at age 14. Her heart unable to handle normal exertion. 2151, the doctors traced her condition back through 4 generations of cousin marriages, each one adding a small genetic weakness that finally manifested in Sarah's failing heart. The Whitaker family's situation proved even more intractable. The severe cognitive impairments that affected so many members couldn't be undone by introducing new genetic material. 2215, the damage was permanent, encoded into the family's DNA like a sentence written in permanent ink. By 1990, social services had finally discovered the family, and what they found was shocking even to professionals accustomed to poverty and neglect. 3 generations lived in a cluster of dilapidated structures without running water or electricity. 2239, the adults, many of them mentally impaired, cared for children who were even more severely affected. Incestuous relationships continued because the impaired adults didn't understand why they shouldn't reproduce with their relatives. Social workers removed several children, but the family's isolation and the adults' inability to comprehend complex social rules meant that new children continued to be born into the same genetic trap. 2309, the Colt family's story took a darker turn when authorities discovered them in 1984. What had been a deliberate policy of genetic isolation had become something more sinister. Multiple generations were living in a compound where appropriate relationships had completely broken down. Brothers and sisters, parents and children, uncles and nieces, the boundaries that most societies maintain had dissolved entirely. 2337, the children removed from the compound showed signs of profound genetic damage, physical deformities, severe cognitive impairments, and medical conditions that doctors had only read about in textbooks. When geneticists analyzed DNA samples from the Colt family, they found something unprecedented in modern America. 2,400 hours, genetic diversity levels comparable to endangered species on the brink of extinction. The family had become so genetically homogeneous that members shared more DNA with each other than typical siblings. Some of the children were technically the product of relationships so close that they were more inbred than if their parents had been identical twins. 2,400 hours 22, the legal system struggled with how to handle these families. Was it abuse if the parents genuinely didn't understand that their actions were harmful? Could you prosecute people for relationships that their community had normalized for over a century? The cases dragged through courts with experts testifying about genetic damage, social workers describing living conditions, and family members defending their way of life with passionate confusion. 2,400 hours 52, public reaction was swift and brutal. News programs featured the families as examples of American poverty and neglect. Photographs of severely impaired children circulated and politicians promised crackdowns on isolated communities. But the outrage faded quickly and the families were left to deal with consequences that would last for generations. 25:16 Medical geneticists began tracking the long-term effects of Appalachian inbreeding. They found elevated rates of nearly every genetic disorder: heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, neurological disorders, and cancers of types rarely seen in the general population. The genetic bottleneck created by generations of cousin marriages had amplified every harmful recessive gene, creating populations where being healthy was the exception rather than the rule. 25:49 Some families tried to break the cycle. Young people who had escaped to cities for education returned with spouses from outside the mountains, deliberately introducing new genetic material. But even this wasn't a perfect solution. The children of these unions were healthier, but they often carried hidden recessive genes that could express themselves in future generations. 26:16 A woman might leave the mountains, marry a man from Ohio, and give birth to a child who seemed perfectly healthy, only for that child's children to manifest conditions inherited from the mountain-dwelling grandparents. The families that remained in isolation continued their patterns. In 2005, researchers revisited the areas where the Fugates, Whitakers, and Colts had lived and found that while those specific families had dispersed or died out, other families had taken their place. 26:50 New surnames, same genetic patterns, same results. The mountains bred isolation, isolation bred genetic closure, and the cycle continued regardless of which names appeared in the family Bible. Environmental factors compounded the genetic damage. The poverty of Appalachia meant poor nutrition, limited medical care, and exposure to environmental toxins from coal mining and manufacturing. 27:15 Children already weakened by genetic disorders faced additional challenges from contaminated water, air pollution, and diets deficient in essential nutrients. The combination created a perfect storm of health problems that transcended simple genetics. Today, the hollow where the blue Fugats lived is quiet. The old homesteads have collapsed into the earth, reclaimed by the forests that always surrounded them. 27:45 But the genetic legacy persists, hidden in the DNA of descendants scattered across Kentucky and beyond. A man in Lexington discovers he carries the gene for methemoglobinemia when his daughter is born with a faint blue tint. A woman in Louisville learns she has an elevated risk for heart disease traced back to 4 generations of cousin marriages in her family tree. 28:11 The mountains may have released their physical grip, but the genetic consequences echo forward. The Whitaker family's story has no happy ending. Some members received care in group homes, their lives structured and supervised by professionals who understand their limitations. Others remain in the mountains, cared for by relatives only slightly less impaired than themselves. 28:35 The family's genetic load is so heavy that even marrying outsiders can't fully dilute it. Recessive genes hide in the DNA of seemingly healthy family members, waiting for the random lottery of reproduction to bring them together again. The Colt compound was demolished, the land sold. 28:58 The family scattered to various institutions and foster homes. But genetic studies of the family continue, providing scientists with valuable, if horrifying, data about the effects of extreme inbreeding. The children removed from the compound in the 1980s are now adults themselves, many struggling with health problems and the psychological trauma of their upbringing. 29:23 Some have chosen not to have children, breaking the genetic chain through conscious decision rather than chance. Scientists estimate that in Appalachia alone, thousands of people carry genetic signatures of historical inbreeding. The effects range from invisible carrier status to profound disability, creating a spectrum of genetic burden that will take generations to fully dissipate. 29:49 Some communities have embraced genetic counseling with young couples testing their DNA before marriage to understand what risks they carry. Others reject such modern interventions, viewing genetic testing as an insult to family heritage or an unwelcome intrusion into private matters. The social stigma attached to these families has softened slightly. 30:13 Mental health awareness and genetic education have helped some people understand that the victims of inbreeding weren't cursed or punished by divine forces. They were simply unlucky inheritors of a genetic legacy created by isolation and limited choices. But stigma persists, particularly in the communities where these families lived. Being known as a descendant of the Blue people or the mentally impaired families carries social consequences that outlast the genetic ones. 30:46 The mountains themselves remain indifferent to the human dramas played out in their hollows. New families have moved into some of the old homesteads, drawn by the beauty and isolation that once trapped earlier residents. Most are outsiders seeking escape from urban life. But a few are descendants of the old families returning to land that holds their genetic history in its soil. 31:12 They farm the same fields, draw water from the same streams, and sometimes marry within the extended family. Because despite everything, the mountains still impose a kind of isolation. Economic development has changed Appalachia, but hasn't erased its fundamental character. The hollows remain remote. 31:35 The poverty persists and the families who stayed continue to navigate a world where their genetic past affects their present and future. A young woman discovers that her chronic fatigue traces back to her great-great-grandparents who were first cousins. A man learns that his heart condition is shared by 15 relatives across 4 generations, all connected through a series of cousin marriages in the 1920s. 32:02 Medical science has advanced tremendously since Dr. Corin first encountered the blue fugates, but genetics still doesn't offer easy fixes for the legacy of inbreeding. Gene therapy, CRISPR, and advanced reproductive technologies hold promise, but they remain expensive and largely unavailable to the descendants of Appalachian families who carry genetic burdens. 32:29 Most manage their conditions with medication, lifestyle changes, and acceptance of limitations that healthy populations never consider. The 20 secrets of Appalachia aren't really secrets anymore. They're documented in scientific journals, featured in documentaries, analyzed in medical schools across the country. But knowing the secrets doesn't erase their effects. 32:52 The blue skin, the cognitive impairments, the physical deformities, these were visible manifestations of a deeper truth about what happens when human populations become too isolated, too closed, too reluctant to mix with outsiders. The families profiled in this investigation represent just a fraction of the genetic damage caused by Appalachian isolation. 33:20 For every Fugate, Whitaker, and Colt documented by researchers, dozens of other families suffered similar fates in hollows so remote that scientists never found them. Some died out entirely, their genetic legacy ending when the last impaired family member passed away. Others continue, hidden from outsiders, managing their conditions with a mixture of mountain wisdom and modern medicine when they can access it. 33:46 The story of Appalachian inbreeding is ultimately a story about the consequences of isolation in all its forms. Geographic isolation created social isolation, which enforced genetic isolation, which produced physical and mental conditions that reinforced all 3 types of isolation. Breaking the cycle required more than just building roads or mandating education. 34:12 It required a fundamental shift in how these communities understood family, marriage, and their relationship to the outside world. Today, young people from these families have choices their ancestors never imagined. They can leave the mountains for education and careers, marry partners from anywhere in the world, and use genetic testing to make informed decisions about reproduction. 34-38 Some exercise these choices, deliberately breaking the patterns that governed their families for generations. Others choose to stay, to marry locally, to maintain connections to land and family that transcend concerns about genetic diversity. Both choices are valid. Both come with consequences, and both reflect the complex legacy of a past that can never be completely erased. 35:05 The mountains stand silent, keeping whatever secrets remain undiscovered. But for those who lived through the genetic consequences of isolation, for the descendants who carry hidden risks in their DNA, and for the communities that must reconcile their past with their present, the 20 Secrets of Appalachia are less folklore and more a genetic inheritance that echoes through generations, a reminder that some choices affect not just those who make them, but everyone who comes after. 35:35 If you've watched until the very end of this investigation, you understand that these weren't just statistics or medical curiosities. These were real families whose choices, limited as they were, created ripples that continue today. Stories this important need to be told, remembered, and understood so that history doesn't repeat itself in other isolated places. 36:17 If this investigation opened your eyes to the hidden realities of genetic isolation, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most disturbing secrets aren't supernatural. They're written in our DNA. The forgotten secrets of Appalachia remind us that isolation, whether chosen or imposed, always comes with a price paid by generations yet unborn.